How's it going, guys? RivalRyyyyy here, and I have a confession to make, and it's a big one. It's definitely my most controversial opinion on Pokemon. But first, it's important to talk about how Pokemon games change forever. On January 29th, 2004 saw the release of Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. These games were an updated version of Generation 1. They were done in the engine of Generation 3, which was very popular, and Pokemon fans absolutely ate it up. And naturally, because of its success, Game Freak and Nintendo saw an opportunity. There was a massive market for playing old games in new formats. Nowadays, this is a very common thing, but back then this was a new situation. Naturally, as time went on with the Generation 2 remakes and the Generation 3 remakes, there was a desire to keep going. After the completion of the Generation 4 remakes, it's natural that the Gen 5 remakes are the first thing on everyone's mind. Generation remakes by this point have become like clockwork for Pokemon. It's just naturally expected to release a new remake or revamp, while simultaneously working on the newest generation. And truth be told, this isn't just related to Pokemon. Every franchise on the planet will do this now. I've seen Dragon Ball Z games get remade, Final Fantasy games, even Metal Gear Solid games. You name it, they've probably either remade it or are looking to. Well, my confession is, I am here to tell you why you should not want a Generation 5 remake. Now, before anyone does think that this is me attacking Generation 5, it's actually quite the contrary. While my personal two favourite generations are still Generation 3 and Generation 4, Gen 5 got a lot of unfair criticism at its time of release. It completely reset Pokemon. Every Pokemon within that region was your only option. You couldn't use the old ones that you loved so much. So it forced you to think outside of the box. You might have used Pokemon that originally you wouldn't plan to in the past. And I definitely think that's a positive thing. And in hindsight, it gets the praise it definitely deserved originally. But I feel it's important to explain why Generation 5 should not get a remake. And as a matter of fact, we should stop the idea of remakes altogether. At least for the time being. So, let's look at it. Here is why you should not want a Generation 5 remake. To start off, just beyond the personal desire of wanting updated graphics and an updated version of your favourite Pokemon games, it's important to look at viable reasons for the game to receive that update. At the end of the day, there is no issue with replaying the old games. Nowadays, there's definitely a rarity in terms of physically owning the original Pokemon games. Pre-owned or new versions of them can get quite expensive very quickly. Take for example Pokemon Heart Gold with the original Pokewalker. You are looking around £160, which is around $200 at this current moment in time. But with the ability to use emulators, considering it's such a wide range and accessible option, there are no real issues stopping you from playing your favourite generations of past. When you look at the changes Pokemon has put into place each generation, there is a viable reason to release the remakes due to changes in the series that have been implemented as a whole. Pokemon from 1996 was astronomically different from Pokemon by 2007. Not to mention that there was original plan just to have two generations anyways, hence why Gold and Silver had so much content in them. Pokemon has now become a global market sensation. Alongside that, there has been a dramatic change to the gameplay. This is to solve multiple issues that previously existed when first created, with big differences in gameplay that would contribute to its success as a competitive form of gameplay, and allow for general day-to-day changes that would make the average player have a better experience overall. Without a shadow of a doubt, the biggest changes came for Generation 1's remakes, which were released during Generation 3. A massive multitude of gameplay changes existed. By this point, Pokemon was here to stay, and so actions were put into place to create a better gameplay. The first major change by Generation 3 was the balancing out of Psychic types from Generation 1. Psychic types along with Dragon types dominated the whole generation. There was a whole multitude of errors that helped contribute to Psychic types domination. First things first, Ghost types were meant to be super effective against Psychic types. Here's the issue, they did nothing. An accidental programming error actually led to them doing 0. But don't worry, it's still weak to bug types. While the strongest base bug move was 25 based, used by Beedrill, which happened to be weak against Psychic types. It's no wonder they dominated. By Generation 3, most of these bugs had been fixed. Not only did Ghost types now do 2 times damage as originally expected, but a whole new type was created in Dark types. And Dark types couldn't even be affected by any Psychic type attacks. Another type was introduced in Steel, which would become a complete defensive juggernaut, and would actually impact the Magnemite line, now gaining that type instead of being just Electric type. The special stat was now split, Originally it was just one stat for both its special attack and special defense. This ended up severely impacting some Pokemon including Tauros. Now Tauros originally had 70 special, along with a high attack and good speed. This made it a great sweeper, but now after the split it only had 40 special attack and 70 special defense, which effectively tanked its usability. Critical hits were once based on speed. This allowed some Pokemon such as Alakazam, who was a psychic type so it already had that benefit, to destroy its competition. By Generation 3 there was a set algorithm that worked out critical hits. Now those are big changes, but there was one change in Generation 3 that really changed the landscape of Pokemon competitively. It introduced the idea of abilities, and some of these abilities would be really beneficial to some Pokemon going forward. For example, Gengar lost a weakness in ground due to the ability of Levitate. Granted, this has now been taken away, but still, it was a big benefit. Or abilities like Intimidate that would automatically lower someone's attack power. Abilities such as Metagross, which stop its stats being lowered. By this point in Pokemon, abilities are such a core part of the series, but in Generation 3 it was a new introduction. When the Gen 2 remakes were brought around, this was during Generation 4, and Generation 4 brought forth a very big change in Pokemon. It introduced the physical special split. Originally, Pokemon types would be the basis for whether a move was special or physical. The actual easiest way to remember this is that if it had an evolution or was dragon type, it was a special based attack, while the rest of them would be physical based. Let's be real, this definitely did not make any sense. You're telling me that Shadow Ball is a physical based attack because it's a ghost type attack? Well, this was finally sorted for Generation 4, and this allowed some Pokemon to finally use the potential they always had. For example, Hitmonchan had the ability to learn Thunder Punch, Ice Punch, and Fire Punch. Top that with the ability Iron Fist for it in Generation 4, this could be a potential hard hitter. Here's the issue, all three of them have evolutions, so they're all special based types. Hitmonchan had 35 base special attack compared to 105 base physical attack. Situations like this, and there is a few, meant some Pokemon were a bit more viable now that this physical and special split had happened. This included benefits in terms of competitive play or in terms of a solo play. This massive gameplay change alone creates some validity in making the Gen 2 remakes, as more Pokemon would now have the ability to shine. When the Generation 3 remakes came out during Generation 6, even more changes had occurred. Remember those pesky dragons? Well, while they were only weak to ice, they were never really a true counter to them. Ice types are actually the worst defensively in the game. They have one resistance, which is themselves, and that's it. Well, Generation 6 sorted this with the creation of the fairy types, which would be immune to any dragon type attacks. To this day, it still remains the last type that was introduced into Pokemon. Thanks to Dark and Fairy types, we allow for the two types that had run rampant to be tamed. Multiple Pokemon also changed to being Fairy type, including a few from the original Generation 1 and Generation 2 games. It not only benefited from the physical and special split that didn't exist in the original games, but a major change had occurred in the creation of Mega Evolutions. Also, quick side note, do you say evolutions or evolutions? My English accent just keeps trying to say evolutions. Anyways, you can think what you want now about Mega Evolutions. You may love them, you may find them game breaking, especially one in particular, or you might find them to be gimmicky, but the reality is, at the time it was a massive change in terms of the franchise. Not only did the original starters get Mega Evolutions, but so did the starters in Generation 3, including an actual type change for one of those starters. The Gen 4 remakes came out at the end of Generation 8. 1 year later, Generation 9 would make its debut on the Switch. And this is where the idea of the remake games really starts to get a bit mucky. Regardless of the issues with the Generation 4 remakes, which I will get to a little bit later on, it's important to talk about the gameplay changes that were brought between Generation 6 and Generation 8. Each gen would bring about a new gimmick style of gameplay, instead of adding a proper style that would stay going forward. I'll give you the full rundown. Generation 6 brought in the concept of Mega Evolutions. Gen 7 brought in Z-moves, which would be a boost in moves to provide a much stronger move. Some Pokemon would get their own special type of move as well. For example, Eevee would get a boost of Last Resort to make the move Extreme Evo Boost. Evo Boost, Evo Boost. I'm really fighting my English accent today. Generation 8 brought in Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, which would show an increase in Pokemon's size and HP. Just around the corner in Generation 9 was Terrestrialization, which allows a Pokemon to change type or boost the moves of a type they already were. Here's the biggest issue with all of these introductions. They are all exclusive to the generation that they are brought in. By this point, it's pretty clear that all of these ideas are very gimmicky as a selling point to that generation. When Mega Evolutions were brought in Generation 6, as a consumer we wouldn't have known that no more would be introduced past Generation 6. It would initially look like a move forward for the franchise. Well, now we know that simply isn't the case. The gameplay changes in battle in all previous generations had a big effect on Pokemon's current gameplay. They had a massive effect on the series as a whole, but now that simply does not happen. There are no gameplay viabilities for bringing forth a remake of Generation 5 that would add to the original games as a whole. The original Gen 5 had triple battles as its almost gimmick itself, and they have only been used in minor instances outside of that gen. There therefore isn't a gameplay reason to make a remake. There would also be a serious concern about the quality of a Gen 5 remake. Recent history of Pokemon has been absolutely marred with big issues in both quality and bugs in the creation of the games. Now, I personally believe there's certain benefits to the recent games. I actually really like the concepts and freedom in Scarlet and Violet. I like what Legends Arceus brings to the table in terms of a different experience. I absolutely love Generation 4, and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are very faithful to the original games. But there's definitely an argument to be made about the bugs and issues in Pokemon that have come from the need to rush and get games out at a very fast and very unreasonable pace. The game that suffered the most with this is most definitely Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which were the most recent remakes released that were actually outsourced from Game Freak on creation. BDSP is a very good topic conversation. I've actually already done a video on that if you want to see my thoughts on it. And seeing some of the comments on that video, I think there's definite positives to take from the games. But I think most would agree that no matter what the case is, there is a serious problem with the games being rushed, hence the many bugs that occurred. And I feel this is further amplified by Scarlet and Violet. There is no hiding from bugs and problems, especially on release date. Naturally, they were all heavily passed around on social media, and for some it's definitely a deal breaker with the franchise. Now, as I said, that doesn't mean there isn't benefits or positive to the most recent games. This isn't a bash on all the recent games created. In fact, it's a bit more of a cry to have more time put into these games. Time that I sadly do not think will be given. And considering that, I think it's truly wise not to create a remake at this current moment in time. Especially while there are problems still going on with Generation 9. DLC is currently in the works to be brought out this year, and I 100% guarantee there'll be games being worked on by Game Freak we are likely unaware of. I say this all the time on my channel, but I'd much rather time be taken on a game to make it as perfect as possible. Time is of the essence to a lot of people, including myself. I'd rather the game take an extra year and be released at its highest capacity than rushed out. And if a Generation 5 remake is created, the reality is it would most likely be rushed out. Therefore, time won't be taken to make sure it's the best possible experience. And I'm actually not trying to fault Game Freak in the slightest for that. If you're already stretched the capacity or you have to meet a deadline, you will naturally either outsource the work or look at cutting corners in order to get to the end product. And there is no point in creating the remakes if it's not going to be full capacity. The solution to this situation, instead of creating the games again, would be to just replay the original Gen 5 games. There are a few different solutions to this. The first is by emulator, which are readily available at any given point, but something that could also be done is bringing the games to Nintendo Switch as a standard port. In a very similar way to how the original Pokemon games were brought to the 3DS, this is very much the best of both worlds for fans and Nintendo, with the exception of the massively updated graphics. Fans will be able to play their favourite generation on the most updated console, while Nintendo get the benefit of still being able to charge a price for the purchase of the games. I completely understand the want for updated graphics in Pokemon games. At the end of the day, with the graphical capabilities of things like the new Zelda games on the Switch, seeing Pokemon obtain this would be a very fun thing. One of the biggest criticisms Pokemon currently gets is its graphical output of the most recent games, especially against a lot of other popular titles on the console. That does mean that Gen 5 is unlikely to really obtain the graphical advantage at this current moment in time. It's therefore a better idea to port the games than recreate them if there is a desire to play them on newer consoles. Overall, personally, I do not feel there is a need for any Gen 5 remakes. While I completely understand the desire for them, and I certainly do not fault anybody for wanting them, if you like a generation, you like a generation. But in terms of gameplay, there is no big change that needs to be added to Gen 5 games that warrant an upgraded game. All previous generations definitely needed them to provide a much better experience. From previous experiences with Gen 3 and Gen 4 remakes, we have discovered that the current gameplay changes are solely for the generation at hand, so there is therefore no advantage to adding this to Gen 5's original games. With the current predicament in terms of bugs and graphics in the most recent games, including the bugs featured in the 3 most recent main releases, which included a new generation, a new concept, and a remake, it's clear that there needs to be a focus on making current projects as crisp and smooth as possible, instead of adding another project onto Game Freak. An alternate to this would be outsourcing this to another team, which would then lead to Pokemon not being made by the original creators. There is no general advantage to Gen 5 receiving remakes. It would not be a true graphical improvement on recent experience, and no big gameplay changes. The best option would be to either emulate or port the games to the Nintendo Switch in order to get the best of both worlds. Gen 5 is honestly fantastic. If you've never played it, it's innovative, different, and an experience like no other. Its third game, which was technically 2, actually provided a difficulty option, both easier and harder, while being the only generation to force people to use completely different Pokemon, as no older Pokemon were available in initial play until after the Elite Four. But just because it's fantastic does not mean it needs to be remade. Thanks for watching, guys. What are your thoughts on Generation 5 and a potential remake for it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps me out. And make sure to follow me on Twitter for more opinions. See you next time, guys.